Have you ever stopped to really wonder how much of your reality or your history and just your actual sense of self is strictly determined by the language you're speaking right now?
Yeah, that is a massive question to just, jump right into.
I mean, really consider the voice inside your head at this exact second you are listening to this deep dive in English. And you have to wonder, does the structure of this specific language actually change the way you perceive the physical world around you?
Right, because usually when we think of language, we just think of it as a utility, like a tool.
Exactly, like a hammer or a telephone wire. It's just a neutral mechanism to transport a raw idea from my brain into your brain. But what if it's not just the wire? What if language is actually the architecture of the ideas themselves?
Well, that concept completely upends the comfortable assumption that words are just, passive vessels for our thoughts.
Yeah.
Because when you strip away the mechanics of grammar and syntax, you are left with something that is deeply intertwined with raw power, with historical memory, and with the very boundaries of human identity. You start to realize that a language doesn't just describe the world. Right. It actually dictates what parts of the world you are even allowed to see.
And that invisible, profound power is exactly what we are jumping into today. The mission of this deep dive is to explore how language shapes identity and dictates power dynamics. And we are doing it by looking specifically at the African post-colonial experience.
Which is, quite frankly, one of the most fascinating historical lenses you could possibly use for this topic.
Absolutely. And we are pulling from two distinct types of source material to get a complete picture for you today. On one hand, we have this academic text called African Languages, Development and the State. That one is edited by Richard Farden and Graham Furness.
And that gives us the macro view, right? The high-level bureaucratic reality of what governments actually call language planning.
Exactly, the macro stuff. But to understand what happens on the ground, inside the human mind, we are pairing that with excerpts from Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature.
Ah, yes.
Which is this absolutely legendary, fiery manifesto by the Kenyan author Ngũgĩ Thiong'o.
It really is legendary. But before we get too deep, it is definitely worth establishing a clear framework for how we are going to approach Ngũgĩ Thiong'o's work today.
Yeah, that is a really good point. We need to be clear about that.
Because Decolonizing the Mind is an intensely passionate manifesto, and it is built on a very specific, politically charged foundation. Ngũgĩ uses a strongly Marxist-influenced lens to analyze history.
Right.
He views the world through the dynamics of class struggle, anti-imperialism, and very harsh critiques of Western capitalism and neo-colonialism. So throughout the text, you will hear terminology like the comprador bourgeoisie or discussions about the alienation of the worker.
Which is pretty heavy terminology.
It is. And to truly grasp the weight of his arguments about language, we really have to look at the world through his specific analytical framework. We want to be explicitly clear to you listening that we aren't here to debate the merits of his political ideology or, take any political sides or adopt it as our own.
Exactly. We are completely impartial here.
Right. We are just putting on his theoretical glasses so we can report impartially on the mechanics of the linguistic and psychological puzzle he is laying out.
I am really glad we established that up front because understanding his framework is essential for grasping the sheer scale of the conflict he describes. But before we get to the deeply personal psychological impact of language that Ngũgĩ details, we need a baseline.
Yeah, we have to look at the state-level reality of language first.
Right. So let's start with the Farden and Furness text. They're looking at the African continent after more than 30 years of post-colonial experience. And the core focus of their work is this bureaucratic concept of language planning.
Language planning. Just the phrase itself is so clinical.
It really is. They gathered all these African and European anthropologists and policymakers to examine how governments actually try to manage language. And the dominant consensus among these contributors is that language policy has to be based on the researched, lived facts of African life rather than preconceived notions.
Which, sounds like a very straightforward, logical, academic recommendation until you look at the historical context.
Oh, yeah. That phrase, preconceived notions, is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
An incredible amount of heavy lifting. Because historically, the relationship between language development and the newly independent African state was entirely dictated by assumptions formulated in European capitals. The colonizing powers left behind these rigid administrative structures built exclusively for their own languages.
Right. So when these newly independent nations tried to build their own language policies, They were basically trying to superimpose Western theoretical frameworks onto a linguistic reality that was unimaginably complex.
And Fardin and Furness point to Nigeria as the ultimate intra-African case study for this dynamic.
So let's look at the mechanics of that Nigerian case study, because the Fardin and Furness text highlights it as just invaluable. Nigeria is the most populous state in Africa. You are dealing with a staggering amount of linguistic diversity.
We are talking hundreds of distinct languages and dialects within a single set of national borders.
Hundreds. And the state has had decades of experience trying to formulate language policy. They've dealt with the immense friction of trying to organize this huge population into a unified administrative whole.
Yeah, the text notes that Nigeria's successes, and more importantly its failures, serve as a crucial blueprint for other nations.
They specifically cite South Africa, actually. At the time this compilation was assembled, South Africa was emerging from apartheid and actively debating how to construct a language policy that didn't just replicate the linguistic domination of the past.
The South African parallel is highly instructive. Just imagine the administrative nightmare facing a newly reorganized state. You have a population that speaks dozens of languages, but the bureaucratic machine demands efficiency.
Right. It needs to function.
It has to decide what language will the judges use in the highest courts. What language will the traffic signs be printed in? What language will the national health broadcast use to explain a new vaccine?
And most critically, what language will the primary school teachers use to teach mathematics to first graders?
Exactly. The state is desperate for a unified system, a single standard that allows the gears of government to turn smoothly.
Okay, but I have to challenge this entire concept of language planning, though.
Oh, how so?
The terminology itself feels so clinical and detached. Like I was saying, it sounds like city zoning.
Right, yeah.
It implies a committee of experts sitting in a sterile room in a capital city, moving languages around on a map like they're deciding where to route a new highway. But we aren't talking about infrastructure here. We are talking about the very mechanism human beings use to express grief or humor or identity.
It's deeply personal.
Exactly. Can a state actually plan something as deeply biological and cultural as language? Or does language just happen organically, and the state is just, I don't know, a frustrated gardener trying to trim a jungle with office scissors?
That is a great analogy, and that tension you are identifying is the exact center of gravity for the Fardin and Furness text. It is the clash between top-down state rhetoric and local lived outcomes. Because the bureaucratic desire is always for a neat, legible system. They want to standardize grammar, publish official dictionaries, mandate curricula. But language, as you said, evolves organically. It happens in the open-air markets, in the living rooms, on the playgrounds.
Right.
So when a state attempts to plan a language using those preconceived top-down ideas, especially when those ideas are inherited from colonial models that view linguistic diversity as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be embraced, it results in a massive systemic disconnect.
So you end up with a situation where government is broadcasting in a formalized, planned version of a language that the people in the rural provinces barely even understand.
Exactly. While the vibrant, evolving street languages are completely ignored by the formal institutions,
Wow.
the state is trying to pave a straight, uniform linguistic highway, but the population is navigating daily life through an ancient, incredibly complex network of linguistic footpaths.
That makes perfect sense.
And this administrative failure, the sheer inability of top-down policy to map onto human reality, leaves us with a critical question. Why is there such a massive chasm between the elite planners in the capital and the everyday people?
Right. Why are the structures of government so divorced from the language of the soil? And that exact mystery is what Ngũgĩ Thiong'o seeks to solve.
Which brings us to the core of decolonizing the mind.
Exactly. If the bureaucratic reality is this frustrating struggle over policy and administration, Ngũgĩ argues that the historical root of this crisis is something far more intentional and far more sinister. He doesn't view this as a mere administrative oversight.
No, not at all.
He frames it as the lingering result of deliberate psychological warfare.
And he begins his argument by attacking the way the world currently perceives African conflicts. He points out that Western media, and just global political discourse in general, relies on a stock interpretation of African reality.
Right, the stock interpretation.
Whenever there is a civil war, a political crisis, or systemic poverty in places like Kenya, Uganda, Zaire, or Nigeria, the global narrative immediately defaults to a very specific framing. It is always tribe A versus tribe B.
Or it is framed as Christian versus Muslim.
Exactly.
The narrative basically implies that there is just this innate, ancient, biological hatred simmering on the continent, that the people are historically prone to violence just because of their ethnic backgrounds.
And Ngũgĩ vehemently asserts that this stock interpretation is a deliberate smokescreen.
The smokescreen?
Yes. It is a modern manifestation of colonial divide and rule tactics. By framing these complex political and economic struggles as primitive tribalism, it deflects attention from what he identifies as the real root cause, which is imperialism. Because if you can convince the global public, and far more devastatingly, if you can convince the African people themselves that their systemic poverty and instability are just inherent flaws in their own culture, you completely distract them from the external economic forces and historical traumas that are actually driving the instability.
And to explain how that distraction was achieved, Ngũgĩ introduces one of the most chilling concepts I have ever encountered in any historical analysis. He calls it the cultural bomb.
The cultural bomb. It is such a striking phrase.
It really is. He writes that the greatest weapon wielded by imperialism isn't the physical violence of the sword or the bullet or the occupying army. Physical domination only controls the body. The ultimate weapon of the colonizer is a bomb that detonates inside the mind of the colonized.
Let's actually break down the mechanics of this cultural bomb, because Ngũgĩ is very specific about how the fallout operates. The purpose of this bomb is annihilation. But it doesn't annihilate buildings. It annihilates a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, and ultimately in their own capacities as human beings.
Wow.
The blast radius of this bomb basically makes the colonized perceive their own historical past as a wasteland of non-achievement.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. A wasteland of non-achievement. Think about the psychological weight of that for the listener.
Yeah.
You were taught that before the colonizer arrived, your ancestors did nothing of value. They built nothing, they thought nothing, they contributed nothing to the human story.
And once that profound sense of shame is fully internalized, the secondary effect of the cultural bomb takes hold. It creates an overwhelming desire within the colonized population to distance themselves from their own history.
They want to shed their mother tongues.
Yes, they want to scrub away their local customs, and simultaneously it installs this desperate yearning to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves, the language, the culture, and the worldview of the colonizer.
It's a complete inversion of pride.
Exactly. The colonizer's language becomes equated with civilization, intelligence, and progress, while the mother tongue becomes a symbol of backwardness and humiliation.
The sheer scale of this psychological operation is just difficult to wrap your head around. But to illustrate it, Ngũgĩ takes us back to 1884, the Berlin Conference.
Oh, yes.
This is the infamous moment when the capitalist powers of Europe gathered around a map and literally carved up the African continent, drawing arbitrary borders through ancient communities and ecosystems. But Ngũgĩ forces us to look at the Berlin Conference differently. He argues that they didn't just carve up physical land, they carved up psychological territories.
He is basically arguing that the Berlin Conference drew the boundaries of the modern African mind. I mean, today we casually refer to African nations as Francophone or Anglophone or Lusophone.
Right, we talk about French-speaking Africa or English-speaking Africa.
Exactly, and Ngũgĩ points out the deep trauma embedded in those casual geographic terms. The identity of an entire continent was suddenly redefined by the languages of European capitals. The political submergence of Africa was formalized in Berlin, but the linguistic and cultural subjugation was the mechanism that actually made it prominent.
And the most tragic part of this mechanism is that the cultural bomb was most effective on the very people you would assume would be immune to it, the intellectuals.
Yeah, that is the real irony here.
The writers, the thinkers, the people who are supposed to be the voice of a nation. To prove how deeply this psychological reprogramming penetrated, Ngũgĩ doesn't point to abstract history. He points directly to his own peers, the intellectual elite of his own generation, and a defining historical event that took place in 1962.
This specific event is so crucial to Ngũgĩ's overarching thesis. The scene is Makerere University College in Kampala, Uganda. The year is 1962, which is a time of massive political transition across the continent as nations are fighting for and gaining independence.
Right, it's a very charged atmosphere.
Extremely. And a historic, momentous gathering is convened. It is titled A Conference of African Writers of English Expression. The most brilliant creative minds from across the continent are invited.
And Ngũgĩ is there. He is just a young student at the time studying English. He has this rough typescript of a novel in progress. And he is walking around completely starstruck, eager to meet the giants of literature who are attending, people like the great Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe.
It must have been incredible.
There is an atmosphere of profound importance, a feeling that they are actively defining the future of African culture.
Yet, looking back on this event from the self-questioning heights of 1986, when he is actually writing Decolonizing the Mind, Ngũgĩ identifies a massive, glaring absurdity at the center of this conference, an absurdity that no one at the time even thought to question.
What was it?
The very title of the gathering, a conference of African writers of English expression, automatically and unapologetically excluded anyone who actually wrote in an African language.
Oh, wow. The exclusions were staggering, right?
Absolutely.
Ngũgĩ points out that Shabaan Robert, who was widely considered the greatest living East African poet at the time, a man with a massive, culturally vital body of work in Kiswahili, did not qualify to attend.
He wasn't invited.
And Fagunwa, a legendary Nigerian writer who published extensively and brilliantly in Yoruba, was not invited. But Ngũgĩ, a young student who had only managed to publish 2 short stories in English, was given a seat at the table.
The paradox is just breathtaking. These intellectuals gathered to debate the very first item on their agenda, which was the fundamental question, what is African literature?
And Ngũgĩ details how incredibly animated and complex this debate was. They argued over the parameters. Did literature have to be written by a biological African to be African literature? Did the subject matter have to strictly concern the African continent?
Right.
If an African writer wrote a novel set entirely in Greenland about an Eskimo, was it still African literature? They debated the geographical and ethnic boundaries endlessly.
Endlessly. But the one boundary they never interrogated, the foundational premise that every single brilliant mind in that room implicitly accepted, was the language of the literature.
Right.
It was simply assumed, almost as a law of physics, that English, French, and Portuguese were the natural, inevitable languages of literary and political mediation in Africa. No one questioned the water they were swimming in.
And what makes this so fascinating is that these writers weren't blindly ignorant. They had complex, deeply considered justifications for why they were writing in European languages. The source text outlines several differing perspectives that highlight how thoroughly entrenched these languages had become.
Yeah, let's look at those.
Chinua Achebe, for instance, offered a very pragmatic defense. He spoke of what he called the fatalistic logic of the unassailable position of English in our literature.
I want to pause on Achebe's stance for a second, because he isn't capitulating. He isn't saying English is superior.
Not at all.
He felt that history had violently handed him this tool, and he fully intended to use it to his advantage. His stated goal was to alter the English language, to bend its syntax and vocabulary, to force it to carry the unique weight of his specific African experience. He basically wanted to make a new English.
Achebe's approach was about subversion from within.
Yes.
Then you had Gabriel Okara, another highly prominent writer, who took a more structural approach. Okara viewed writing in English almost like an exercise in real-time translation.
How so?
Well, he wanted to capture the vivid, specific imagery and social norms of his native Ijaw language and express those exact conceptual frameworks in English. He was trying to keep the English words as close as possible to the Ijaw vernacular expression.
Ah, I see.
And from a completely different angle, you had Ezekiel Mafulele, who argued from a strictly political standpoint.
Right. Mafulele was looking at the continent as a whole. He argued that European languages had become a necessary unifying force. In a continent with thousands of distinct mother tongues, English and French provided a common medium to present a united nationalist front against white oppressors.
So it was a tool for unity.
Exactly. He viewed the colonial language as the only practical way to build a Pan-African solidarity movement.
So you have these 3 giants of literature, Achebe subverting the language, Okara translating through it, Mfulele using it as a political unifier. It all sounds highly rational.
It does.
But Ngũgĩ introduces a lone voice of dissent that cuts through all of these justifications. He points to an intervention made 2 years later in 1964 by a Nigerian scholar named Obi Wale. And Obi Wale essentially pulled the intellectual rug out from under the entire continent's literary elite.
Yeah, Obi Wale did not hold back.
What exactly did he say?
He published an article stating plainly that this entire uncritical acceptance of English and French was a complete dead end. He argued without compromise that true African literature must be written in African languages, period.
Wow.
He asserted that until African writers returned to their mother tongues, whatever they were creating in English or French was merely a minor, exotic offshoot of European literature. It wasn't African literature, it was Afro-European literature.
Afro-European. When you read Ngũgĩ reflecting on Obiwale's critique, you can feel a profound sense of tragedy. He realizes that an entire generation of the continent's most creative, brilliant minds had dedicated their lives to performing what he terms literary gymnastics.
Literary gymnastics. That phrase perfectly captures the exhausting effort of their work. Ngũgĩ realized they were obsessing over how to harvest the wealth of their own African languages, taking their ancient proverbs, their complex mythology, their vivid folklore, and injecting it into English or French.
Right.
They were doing this to give the foreign languages more life, more vigor, and more texture.
They were strip mining their own cultural heritage to build monuments in the language of the colonizer. Ngũgĩ asks a devastating question. Why did these writers not feel the fundamental responsibility to enrich their own languages?
It's a haunting question.
Shakespeare took the raw material of English and expanded its capacity forever. Tolstoy did the same for Russian. Why were the greatest African minds abandoning their mother tongues to rot while working tirelessly to decorate the linguistic mansions of London and Paris?
It is a sweeping, deeply painful critique of his own legacy and his own peers. But Ngũgĩ is a very careful thinker. He doesn't just lay blame at the feet of the writers and leave it there.
No, he wants to know why.
Exactly. He asks the vital structural question. How did this happen? How did a whole generation of fiercely intelligent, anti-colonial African writers come to accept the absolute supremacy of English so completely?
And to answer that question, to truly explain the mechanics of the cultural bomb, Ngũgĩ takes us away from the high-minded academic debates in the university halls of Kampala. He brings us down to the dirt roads of his own childhood in Kenya. He shows us exactly how the bomb is planted in the mind of a child.
He shares his origin story, and it is a stark contrast to the sterile halls of Makerere. Ngũgĩ was born into a large peasant family in Kenya. He describes a family structure with 4 wives and about 28 children.
Wow.
And they grew up speaking Gĩkũyũ. He paints an incredibly vivid, harmonious picture of his early life. The community worked the fields together, speaking Gĩkũyũ, and in the evenings they would gather around the fireside for storytelling.
And the storytelling wasn't just, entertainment. It was the foundational educational system of the community. He notes that the language wasn't just a collection of words. It was the carrier of their deepest moral and ethical values. He describes the specific structure of these fireside stories. Mostly animals were the main characters. But the hero of these tales wasn't the strong, dominant predator. The hero was almost always the hare.
The hare.
Yeah. A small, physically weak creature, but one that was entirely full of innovative wit and cunning.
The symbolism of the hare is essential to understanding the culture being transmitted. In these stories, the small hare is constantly struggling against the brute forces of nature, the lion, the leopard, the hyena.
Right.
And every time the hare outwitted the lion, it was celebrated as a victory for the people. The stories were teaching the children that the apparently weak could outsmart the strong. They were teaching the absolute necessity of cooperation and community harmony to survive against hostile environments and predatory forces.
So the language they spoke in the evening around the fire was the exact same language they used to conceptualize the world, to work the land, and to relate to one another. There was a complete, unbroken harmony between the child's physical environment, their social environment, and their language.
It was cohesive.
Exactly. Ngũgĩ even mentions that his early pre-primary education in the colonial schools was initially conducted in Ngũgĩ. He fondly remembers the intense pride of receiving an ovation from his teachers and peers for a composition he wrote in his mother tongue.
But that harmony is violently shattered. Ngũgĩ identifies the exact turning point. The year is 1952.
What specifically triggers the rupture in 1952?
1952 marks the declaration of a state of emergency over Kenya by the British colonial government. This was the height of the Mau Mau uprising, which was a militant anti-colonial rebellion fighting for land and freedom.
Okay.
In response to the uprising, the colonial regime initiated an immense, brutal crackdown. And one of the most critical elements of this crackdown was the complete seizure of the educational system. All the independent schools that had been run by patriotic Kenyan nationalists were taken over by the colonial regime and placed under the direct control of district education boards.
Which were, of course, chaired by Englishmen.
Of course. And the most devastating policy change enacted by these new boards was linguistic. English was no longer just a subject you learned. English became the sole language of formal education. In Kenya, English was elevated to the status of a god. All other languages had to bow before it.
And this wasn't merely a shift in the curriculum. The way Ngũgĩ describes the enforcement of this policy, it was an organized regime of psychological terror. He draws a direct parallel between the physical violence of the battlefield, the colonial military using swords and bullets to conquer the land, and the psychological violence of the classroom, using chalk and the blackboard to conquer the mind.
It's a chilling parallel.
The source text details the visceral, deeply humiliating punishments instituted to enforce this new linguistic order. If a child was caught speaking even a single word of Gĩkũyũ in the vicinity of the school, the retribution was swift and physical.
What did they do?
They were subjected to corporal punishment, usually 3 to 5 strokes of the cane on their bare buttocks. Or, in a tactic designed purely for psychological humiliation, they were forced to wear a heavy metal plate around their neck with inscriptions reading, "I am stupid," or "I am a donkey."
That is horrifying. But as horrific as the physical beatings were, the most insidious, culturally destructive part of this disciplinary system was the method used to catch the culprits. The colonial teachers instituted what was known as the button system.
Let's explain how the button system worked, because this is where the true damage is done.
A button was given to a single pupil at the start of the day. If that pupil heard anyone speaking their mother tongue, they were supposed to hand the button to the offender.
Okay.
That person then had to pass it to the next person they caught speaking the local language. Whoever was holding the button at the end of the school day had to stand up in front of the classroom and sing out the names of every single person who had passed it to them.
It is a masterclass in psychological warfare. It turned young children into active witch hunters. It taught them that there was lucrative protective value in being a traitor to their own immediate community.
Yeah.
If you betray your friend, you avoid the cane. If you inform on your sibling, you avoid the metal plate. It destroys the very fabric of cooperation and trust that the fireside stories about the hare were trying to build.
It is the absolute textbook definition of colonial alienation. The physical violence of the military conquered the territory, but the psychological violence of the classroom conquered the internal landscape of the mind. As Ngũgĩ so powerfully summarizes, the cannon forces the body, but the school fascinates the soul.
And it wasn't just about punishment. The entire reward system of society was completely inverted.
Right.
While speaking your mother tongue brought public humiliation and physical pain, achievement in English brought massive rewards. Prizes, prestige, the applause of the teachers. English became the singular, exclusive measure of human intelligence.
The academic structure reinforced this entirely. You could be a prodigy in mathematics, you could excel in science or nature study, but if you failed your English exam, you failed the entire year.
Wow.
You were barred from moving on to secondary school. Conversely, you could fail every other subject, but if you passed English, you were considered smart. English became the ultimate magic formula, the only ticket to colonial elitism and survival.
We can clearly see the trauma of this system. We can see the brutal mechanics of how the language was forced onto these children. But Ngũgĩ's analysis goes even deeper than recounting the abuse.
Yeah, he takes it a step further.
He shifts from his personal childhood trauma to a profound philosophical breakdown of why changing a child's language is so inherently devastating to their worldview. To do this, he introduces his theory of the dual character of language.
This is where Ngũgĩ really flexes his theoretical muscles and where we must explicitly apply that Marxist framework we discussed in the introduction. Ngũgĩ argues that any language, has a dual character. It functions simultaneously as a means of communication and as a carrier of culture.
Okay, let's break that down.
He breaks down the communication aspect into 3 distinct layers, drawing directly from Marxist ideas of labor and production. The first layer is what he calls the language of real life. In Marxist terms, this is the foundational element of human interaction, the relations people enter into with one another in the physical labor process.
So the cooperation required to produce wealth, grow food, or weave clothing.
Exactly. The second layer is speech, which is simply the verbal imitation of that language of real life. And the third layer is written signs, the alphabet, which is an imitation of the spoken word.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to use an analogy to try and ground this because it's a dense philosophical concept. Think of language as the architectural blueprint for a house, but also as the actual soil the house is built on.
Okay, blueprint and soil.
Right, the communication aspect, the grammar, the speech, the written signs, that is the blueprint. It shows you how the pipes connect, how to get from room to room, how basic interactions function. It is structural. But language as culture, that is the soil itself. Ngũgĩ says culture is the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history. It embodies their moral, ethical, and aesthetic values.
That is a very apt analogy. The culture is the soil that holds the roots of the community. Ngũgĩ actually uses a beautiful phrase to describe this. He says, culture provides the spiritual eyeglasses through which a community views themselves and their place in the universe.
The spiritual eyeglasses. So when a child is raised in their mother tongue, speaking the language of their parents, there is a broad stabilizing harmony. The spoken word reflects their daily life and environment. The written word, if they have one, reflects the spoken word.
Everything aligns.
Exactly. The culture transmitted through that language perfectly aligns with the physical world and the social relations they see around them. The blueprint matches the soil perfectly.
But when a colonial language is violently imposed upon a child, that foundational harmony is irrevocably broken. The child is suddenly handed a blueprint for a house built in London and told to overlay it onto the soil of Kenya.
He calls this specific break colonial alienation. The language of a child's conceptualization, the language of their formal education, becomes entirely foreign. The written language of their schooling divorces them from the spoken language of their home.
And this alienation isn't merely a matter of struggling with foreign vocabulary. It fundamentally alters how the child perceives reality itself. Ngũgĩ provides a brilliant, subtle, linguistic example of this from his own life.
What was the example?
He mentions that when he first learned the English word missile, it held an alien, faraway sound to his ear. It was just an abstract, cerebral concept. It meant nothing to his felt experience. But when he later learned its equivalent in Gĩkũyũ, the word immediately connected to a physical reality he understood.
It had roots.
Exactly. It changed how he apprehended the object. Under the colonial system, learning for an African child became a purely cerebral activity, completely detached from emotional depth and lived experience.
The specific examples he gives of this alienation in the source text are incredibly jarring. Once these Kenyan children were forced out of the world of the cunning hare and the leopard, what were they actually reading in these English classrooms?
Good question.
They were reading Charles Dickens, they were reading Rider Haggard and Robert Louis Stevenson. Their daily companions in the world of imagination were suddenly Oliver Twist and Jim Hawkins.
And if it were only a matter of reading foreign adventure stories, it would be alienating enough. But it was far more destructive than that. These children were encountering literature that actively and systematically demeaned them.
Yeah.
They were reading Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, encountering horrific, grotesque descriptions of old African women like the character Ngũgĩ. The literature taught them to view their own people as monstrous.
It wasn't just fiction either. They were encountering racist philosophy presented as the highest echelons of human thought. Ngũgĩ points out that they were assigned readings from Enlightenment philosophers like David Hume and Thomas Jefferson, men who explicitly argued that Black people were naturally inferior in endowments of both body and mind.
Which is just devastating to read as a child.
They were forced to read Hegel, who literally wrote that Africa was a land of childhood, enveloped in the dark mantle of the night, claiming there was nothing harmonious with humanity to be found in the African character.
Put yourself in the mind of a 12-year-old child. You have been beaten for speaking the language of your parents. You have been told that English is the only path to intelligence.
Right.
And when you finally master this language of the elite, you open the most revered books in that language, and the books tell you that you are biologically inferior, that your history is dark, and your people are primitive.
It's a complete psychological trap.
The child inevitably begins to view their own world, their own parents, their own skin, through the distorted, prejudiced lens of the colonizer. It forces the child to see themselves from the outside as if they were a stranger to their own body.
That is the ultimate catastrophic victory of the cultural bomb. The negative images are no longer enforced by the colonizer. They are internalized by the colonized. And the text notes some extreme, almost unbelievable manifestations of this internal colonization among the African elite.
Oh, the examples Ngũgĩ provides of the elite's capitulation are striking. He mentions Léopold Sédar Senghor, the great poet and the first president of Senegal.
Senghor, right.
Senghor was a brilliant man, a founder of the Negritude movement. He explicitly acknowledged that the French language had been violently forced upon him, and yet he became so deeply lyricized, so seduced by French, that he publicly called it a language of gentleness and honesty.
Wow.
He was eventually anointed into the French Academy, an institution historically dedicated to safeguarding the purity of the French language from foreign influence.
It's mind-boggling. And then there's the example of President Hastings Banda in Malawi, which sounds like something out of a satirical novel, but It is entirely real. President Banda built his own grand monument to education, the Kamuzu Academy.
Yes.
It was an elite grammar school, explicitly designed to produce boys and girls who could compete at Harvard and Oxford. The president mandated that Latin should occupy a central, revered place in the curriculum.
Latin.
Yes, Latin. And, as the ultimate insult to his own people, no Malawian was allowed to teach the academy. All the teaching staff were aggressively recruited from Britain because no local educator was deemed good enough to teach the classics.
It is a stunning, tragic example of what Ngũgĩ diagnoses as a servile worship of what is foreign.
Yeah.
So when Ngũgĩ returns his focus to that Maker conference of 1962, his perspective is entirely shifted.
He sees it differently.
He no longer views it as a triumph of African literary emergence. He views it as the final, quiet triumph of a system of colonial domination. The petty bourgeoisie writers, trained in these very colonial schools, had completely accepted the fatalistic logic of English. They were trapped, willingly, within the linguistic fence of their colonial inheritance.
Wait. If the intellectual elite were entirely captured, if the greatest writers and presidents were building academies to teach Latin and writing novels in French, who actually kept the African languages alive?
Right.
Because these languages didn't die. So who resisted the blast of the cultural bomb?
This is the turning point in Ngũgĩ's text, where he shifts from a grim critique of his peers to a soaring celebration of the masses. The heroes of decolonizing the mind are not the university professors.
Who are they?
The heroes are the peasantry and the urban working class. They were the ones who absolutely refused to let African languages go the way of Latin and become dead fossils for linguistic archaeology.
The text notes that these working class people saw absolutely no contradiction between their immediate nationality, being proudly Yoruba or Gĩkũyũ or Zulu, and their broader continental geography as Africans.
Exactly.
While the intellectuals were agonizing over how to unify the continent through English, the peasantry happily kept their local languages alive in the dirt and the sweat of daily life. They used them in their harvest ceremonies, in their local political struggles, in their proverbs, their work songs, and their riddles.
Because they were not alienated from the labor of the land, they were not alienated from the language of the land. The peasantry and the urban working class threw up their own organic singers and writers.
They didn't need the elite.
Nope. These were artists who didn't care about publishing in London. They coined new words and dynamically expanded their local languages to incorporate new global happenings. They kept the languages breathing.
And Ngũgĩ singles out specific, incredible heroes here. He talks about Gakara wa Wanjash in Kenya. Here is a man who was targeted during the Mau Mau uprising. He was jailed by the British for 10 solid years.
10 years.
And his crime wasn't taking up arms. His crime was simply writing and publishing in Gĩkũyũ. And what did he do in prison? He literally wrote a book in Gĩkũyũ, in secret, hiding the pages while enduring all the deprivations of a political detention camp. He never once broke his faith in the possibilities of Kenya's national languages.
That kind of unbelievable resilience, that refusal to be silenced, eventually leads Ngũgĩ to a massive personal and artistic awakening. This takes us into Chapter 2 of the source material. The year is 1976.
Okay, 1976.
Ngũgĩ's position in society at this time is very comfortable. He is the chairman of the literature department at the University of Nairobi. He is an established, respected author in English. But one Sunday morning, a woman from the nearby village of Makerere comes to his house.
And her approach is so direct and challenging. She says to him, "We hear you have a lot of education and that you write books. Why don't you and others of your kind give some of that education to the village?"
She isn't asking for money.
No. She wants his help to revive a local youth center of the village that has fallen into disrepair.
And that single request sparks the Makerere experiment, which becomes the absolute watershed moment in Ngũgĩ's life. He agrees to help, but he doesn't come in as the educated savior dictating terms. He joins a collective effort.
Right.
The organizing committee involves local peasants, factory workers from the nearby Bata shoe factory, unemployed youth, and university staff like himself. They decide that the best way to unite and uplift the community is to create theater. But, crucially, not theater in English, theater in the language of the village Gĩkũyũ.
The battle over drama and theater in Kenya is a fascinating, deeply political subplot in this text. Ngũgĩ contrasts this new organic community theater they are trying to build with the pre-colonial traditions that were lost. He explains that in pre-colonial Kenya, Drama wasn't an isolated commercial event that happened in a special building on a Friday night.
No, it was woven into life.
Exactly. Drama was part and parcel of the rhythm of daily and seasonal life.
He specifically mentions the Ituika ceremony among the Gĩkũyũ people. This was a massive society-wide event held every 25 years to mark the handing over of power from one generation to the next. It wasn't just a quick inauguration.
Right, it was huge.
It was celebrated with feasting, dancing, and singing over a 6-month period. And the crucial point is that the laws and regulations of the society, the history of the people, were literally embodied in the rhythmic movements of the dances and the lyrics of the songs. The community enacted its own history.
But the British colonial administration recognized the immense unifying power of those ceremonies, and they actively sought to destroy that tradition. They feared large gatherings of natives. The colonial government and the missionaries banned these ceremonies unless they had a specific, heavily monitored license. The Ituika ceremony was completely banned in 1925.
And having destroyed the organic communal theater, the colonial regime replaced it with what the British director Peter Brook called the empty space.
The empty space?
The British tried to confine all dramatic expression to government-supervised urban community halls, school auditoriums, and formal theater buildings with proscenium stages. They created a physical separation between the actor and the audience, which mirrored the separation between the elite and the peasant.
Wow.
They even confined theater to barbed wire prisons and detention camps, where they actively encouraged political detainees to produce slavishly pro-colonial propaganda plays to demonstrate their rehabilitation.
That is incredibly twisted. And in the elite colonial schools, like the Alliance High School that Ngũgĩ attended, the curriculum was entirely dominated by Shakespeare and George Bernard Shaw. Or, on the radio, the British pushed comedies that portrayed Africans as mindless, grinning clowns.
Like the character Kapanga.
Exactly. Kapanga was a minstrel-like figure designed to make Africans laugh at their own supposed stupidity and simplicity, keeping them docile and forgetful of their lack of freedom. The British established the Kenyan National Theatre, but it was essentially a segregated country club for European expatriates to watch British plays.
Understanding that oppressive history makes the Makerere experiment so radical. When Ngũgĩ, the university professor, and the Bata factory workers decide to write and produce a play together in Gĩkũyũ, it is a profound act of political rebellion.
They are breaking it out.
Yes, they are breaking the drama out of the colonial empty space and returning it to the open air of the community. They are tearing down the linguistic fence.
And Ngũgĩ realizes in this moment that when you write and perform in an African language, addressing the peasants and workers directly, bypassing the English-speaking elite entirely, your art takes on an inherently subversive character.
Highly subversive.
You're communicating a message of revolutionary unity, a shared history of struggle, and a vision of hope that the ruling regimes cannot intercept or control, because they often don't even speak the language of the village.
Which leads directly to Ngũgĩ's ultimate, uncompromising conclusion. The text features a section literally titled "A Statement." It is his point of no return.
This is the climax of the book.
Yes. The year is 1977. After 17 years of deep involvement in what he now disparagingly calls Afro-European literature, he publishes his novel Petals of Blood. And with that publication, he bids a final, permanent farewell to the English language as a vehicle for his creative writing.
He simply walks away from the global English publishing apparatus. From that point forward, he commits to writing his novels and plays exclusively in Gĩkũyũ and Kiswahili.
He stops looking at his mother tongue through the colonizer's lens as a mark of backwardness.
Right, and he aggressively reclaims it as a revolutionary tool of unity. His thesis crystallizes here. You cannot truly decolonize the mind while you are still dreaming, conceptualizing, and creating in the language of the colonizer.
It is a radical, life-altering shift in his artistic identity. His stated goal from that moment on is to help restore the harmony for the Kenyan child. He wants to repair that broken link between the blueprint and the soil.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
He wants Kenyan mother tongues to carry a rich, modern literature that reflects not only the natural rhythms of a child's spoken expression, but also their contemporary struggles with nature and society.
Because it's not about being isolated.
Not at all. He argues that only from a solid foundation of linguistic harmony and cultural pride can an African truly learn other languages, like English or French, and enjoy the positive, democratic elements in other cultures without suffering from a crippling complex of inferiority.
To synthesize this massive historical journey we've been on today, we started by looking at the macro level with the Farton and Furness text.
Yeah.
We saw governments in Nigeria and South Africa struggling with the bureaucratic, top-down nightmare of language planning, trying to force complex realities into neat administrative boxes.
Right.
Then we used Ngũgĩ's Marxist influence lens to diagnose why that disconnect exists. We saw the deliberate psychological warfare of the cultural bomb, designed to make people despise their own heritage.
We saw the damage firsthand.
We walked through the visceral trauma of the colonial classroom, where children were turned into informants over a spoken word. We explored the deep philosophical divide between language as a mere tool of communication and language as the very soul and memory of a culture. And finally, we ended with a triumphant communal act of rebellion, returning to the mother tongue in the village of Kameriyet.
When you pull all of these threads together, the core truth that emerges is undeniable. Language is never, ever neutral.
Never.
It is not just a tool you pick up and put down. It is the operating system of human reality. It carries the heavy, invisible weight of history, of power dynamics, of subjugation, and of liberation.
So what does this all mean for us?
What Thiong'o forces us to understand is that when a people loses a language, they do not just lose a dictionary of vocabulary words. They lose an entire universe of values, a highly specific way of interacting with nature, a rich history of struggle, and a profound form of human connection. To reclaim a language is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of reclaiming the fundamental right to define your own reality.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to really mull over. Ngũgĩ clearly mapped out how colonial powers in the 20th century used literature, classrooms, and physical punishment as a cultural bomb to reshape the minds of millions.
A very deliberate strategy.
But today, we live in a completely different era. We live in an age of a globalized internet, an era driven by invisible proprietary algorithms, dominated by a handful of major digital languages, and shaped by massive multinational tech platforms based in places like Silicon Valley.
That's very true.
So you have to ask yourself, what subtle digital cultural bombs might be quietly rewriting your own understanding of the world, your history, and your community right now? As you scroll through endless streams of homogenized content, are the words you use every day, the cultural references you make, and the ideas they carry truly your own? Or is the blueprint of your mind being quietly redrawn by a language you didn't choose? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.